Welcome to this episode of the Ohio Lodge of Research podcast, OLR Connections. Past Master of the Ohio Lodge of Research, Chad Kopenski, has a conversation with Daniel Gardiner, Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Montana, where they discuss many topics, but focus on Brother Gardiner's idea that research is for anyone.
But I think most guys who I've talked to start going into like research or start that path because all of a sudden they see something in ritual that is weird and they wonder why, right? Like they're talking to somebody at a conference or someplace else and they're like, oh, well, we don't do that. That's weird. I wonder why.
As Brett Morris likes to say in a lecture he gives, well, that's different, or
Yeah.
that's interesting, because you go, that doesn't look right, and you just keep asking questions, right?
Sure. It's, yeah, like, I don't know. I used to think that when I started in masonry, at some point I would get that point of feeling settled, like, oh, I know stuff. I know some stuff. Man, there's so much I don't know though. So
That's okay though, right? So this might be a great segue into a question I anticipate you're going to ask based on the type of questions and conversations we've had. But what kind of education is there, and what's in it for you or me or anyone else? And education's for everybody, and education pretty much is masonry, right? And it's a big enough tent for almost all of us, and you could pretty much find any of the avenues you want. And so I learned a long time ago, there's certain things that just may not be interesting to me, and that's okay. That there's other people who that's their area of expertise, and unless it adjoins what it is I need to be talking about or researching in my own mind, I've made that determination. That's what I want to do or I need to do. Then I don't necessarily need to know. So, for example, there's a guy named Andrew Pink or someone like Brent Morris. They have an interest in music and masonry, so they've written some interesting academic pieces on that sort of stuff. It's not as interesting to me, so I don't become proficient in it until I need to be. Like, okay, is this song, which is in this particular constitutions and these people, is that relevant? Because maybe it sets the stage for this was the kind of daily life for the officers of the Grand Lodge of Ireland in 1725, and I need to know that this is the kind of thing that all the Grand Lodge officers were involved in. It doesn't resonate with me, but now it's important to the story that I'd like to tell, so I need to get familiar with it. In that sense, then okay, sure, I get to know everything there is about it. I'm gonna bite it. I'm gonna smell it. Okay, what is this? I'm gonna roll around, make snow angels in it. Okay, I think I've got a feeling for this now. But until then, there's a lot of areas I don't roll around in. But masonry can be, there's room for all of us, right?
But when you need it, you know who to go to. Like, oh, you ask around, like, oh, you need to be talking to this person. But then the other thing is that because I don't know what I'm doing, oftentimes I'll ask questions that I don't know make sense to my mind at the time that may not be logical, but all of a sudden open up a whole different type of thing that you would never. I didn't know was possible because I'm like, it doesn't follow Earth logic. It follows Chad logic, and then it makes sense in the wide picture. Does that make sense?
But because exactly like you say, you don't know the supposed roadblocks or whatever, you're going to keep pushing on things that everybody else gave up on. They're like, well, this doesn't exist, so they don't go looking for it. And in your mind, well, surely it exists somewhere. And then you go, and hey, guess what? I found 3 more things nobody knew he printed. And it's continuing to happen. You do need to print, though. You do need to publish. Yeah, and I'm going to keep hammering at you. What you need to do is release pieces of it and then go back and update. But you need to get out of your comfort zone. And what you need to do is not only A, have pieces of it out there, but B, other people might be able to riff off of it. And C, those are the appendices to the book you're going to be publishing at some point. Because all the information needs to be available. If you've collected that much, it's ridiculous to not do the whole thing.
I will say that one of the biggest roadblocks I have to doing anything is I have so much stuff. I like your idea of releasing a little bit at a time. I think there's two hard parts, and maybe you can speak about this. One is knowing where to start getting your stuff out there. The second is, I think, I don't know if it's imposter syndrome or what it is, but the idea of what I'm looking at, not just me, anybody doing this research, like, what do I have to contribute? Surely if I'm looking at this, surely somebody else has. Or what am I going to say that's even, I mean, surely somebody else has discovered this and said this better. I mean, who the hell am I?
So, I remember one time having a conversation along those lines with you, and the irony is no one else had, right? So where do we go to? Like when someone asks me about this, I just say, Chad's your guy, right? You became the de facto guy, and you like to say you just kind of fell into it, which in your opinion may be true, but the reality is everyone else may have fell into their little niche at some point in 1962 when someone else was writing a particular thing. They may have felt that they fell into it, but it's not out there. And to address the imposter syndrome, I still feel that a lot of folks do. You wonder, why am I the guy? Am I doing the right thing? Especially as if you're not in an academic setting, you're basically doing this alone. You're soloing this. And in an academic setting, you get feedback from teachers, from cohorts. There's something that'll channel it, and they might say, here's where you may take this, or my recommendation is why are you bringing this into the story? And it's kind of like the special effect without a story is a pretty boring thing. They might just say, you know what, I think you're kind of losing the plot here. Maybe bring your writing a little bit tighter in this area. But you're kind of like, you and I are essentially, for the most part, I think, doing a lot of this on our own. We're solo, right? You're kind of in your own doing this. That leaves you feeling a bit of an imposter, even if it's not the case. And then when you say it's the start, I find the end is actually the difficult part for me. And I think maybe for you in this case, because on the one hand, you don't want to let it go. This is your pet project. This is your baby. And if you put an end to it, even if intellectually it's not really the end, it becomes, then you have to stop. It's like watching your favorite characters no longer, like, I'll give an example.
The end of Firefly, the end of Next
Yes.
Generation type of thing. Yeah.
Yes. I think you and I don't want to let go, right? And then it becomes, there's also, this ties in with the imposter syndrome. What if I've said something and now 3 years later I realize that may have been correct as far as I knew, but it is not nearly the right story. And in fact, it's probably the wrong outcome as a whole for the arc of what I was telling the story. That's okay, because that's what's been happening for the last hundreds of years. Is we go back and we read something and everyone says every book says X, Y, and Z, and then they keep repeating that, and everyone will tell you, including some of the figures who are writing today. They'll say, oh, this is what X, Y, and Z says. There's a popular book that's out there, came out a couple of years ago. I won't name the person or the book, but it's quoted quite frequently on the American Ritual and so on. And it is the book I would have written the very first year I was a Mason. And individually, many of the things in there are correct, but collectively, they don't tell the story that the person has collected them to say. So it's fact stacking. This might be correct. This might be correct. This is correct. But none of them actually go together. And the outcome is not actually correctly derived from. But I would also say that many of the things that are in there are not actually factually correct. They're attributing to a footnote like this book and 8 other books that all agree this is what it is. But if you go back and look at the actual original document, they all got it wrong. They quoted the wrong part of it and they wrote something wrong, and they all just keep repeating what one guy said. And so we all assume that that one thing is correct. And so I would challenge you to just finish. At some point, finish something, and don't finish the whole thing. Now you're trying to finish the elephant. Just finish the tail.
It's a huge ass story to tell, but you're right. I don't need to tell the whole story. I need to tell a chunk right here.
Looking. You don't have to stop looking while you're finishing that one thing. So you're finishing Appendix D and you're still looking. They're parallel. They're not independent. It's not like I can only look and write for the whole story and I can't do this. You're capable of doing both. And we need that. You have information that may be crucial to a story I want to tell. And until you've got it out there, it's doing me no good too, man. And frankly, this is a perfect time. We need that storytelling. Masonry is like craving the education kind of component. People love storytelling. I was talking with my grandmaster this morning about he had some Slayer playing, and I was like, I like Iron Maiden, and he's like, yeah, and you know what? You know a bunch of history by the time you're done, because these guys go off on they're deep in the lore that they do, and my response is, yeah, because it's a saga, right? It's an actual saga. You're a bard. Bruce Dickinson is out there singing information, and you're retaining that kind of thing. We need you to do some of that kind of stuff, right? We need you to be storytelling, because we want that. We need that right now.
Well, the other thing that I think is interesting, you said a few minutes ago, and again,
Yeah, go back.
You talk about the idea of fact stacking. When you look at sort of Masonic research, when I first got into it, I saw sort of like two main camps. One was stating a boatload of facts and then trying to give those facts context, even though they didn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. Or what we saw was trying to make Masonry fit a pre-existing narrative. It was, I really love martial arts, so I'm going to say that martial arts and Masonry are connected. Or I really, woodworking really helped me understand the world, therefore woodworking and Masonry. See, there's all these correlations and connections. And neither one of those really spoke to me when I first got into Masonic research. Am I way off base with that or no?
No, and I would like to state that there can be room for that latter category of where people say, you know what, this is my personal journey. I enjoy it. Just state, like, here's an opinion, right? You just say, this is my opinion. These things bear a similarity. They may not historically be connected. It may not be that Masonry impacted the world of woodworking, but, in the way that people might think of, like, oh, they're responsible for X, Y, and Z. But it could be that, you can draw some interesting parallels or things that might be applicable to your life. And in my opinion, right? So as long as you throw out occasionally, in my opinion, those things are definitely valuable at times. And the same thing with the fact stacking. I think there's a utility in the sense that there can be good to digest something. There could be good found in that. So like somebody might say, I've read 20 volumes of whatever these things are. Here's the summary, the analysis of that kind of thing. Quite frankly, a lot of people aren't going to read 20 volumes of whatever, but it might be great to pick the bullet points of all those things, put them in there, and people can use those. But I also agree with you in that, yeah, fact stacking frequently comes up with something that does not fit any of the rest of the information. And then the other example often leads into not just speculation, feeling versus what they could be telling. And like I said, there could be room potentially for either of those within a certain range, but they frequently veer off and go bad.
If you're gonna stack the facts and come away with, sort of a romanticized narrative or a narrative that doesn't necessarily follow the facts, I don't know. I mean, there has to be
It
some
don't do
kind of
it for me,
benefit to
Chad.
that, right? What?
If you want chicken soup for the soul, let's go for that and just write the feel good story. And there's 100 of those that you can do today that are true. There's a guy
Small
in
team,
Oregon.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, true stories, things that happen. Not like this is a universal truth of like, here I'm telling you about like, the nature of man and whatever else, why are we here? We're just talking about like a dude in Oregon ends up getting his ear nearly sheared off, and it turns out the EMT, the first responder to the scene, is a Mason, and yada yada. And there's something inspiring about that kind of thing, right? Let's do that. I agree with you, and that's why
Yeah.
somewhat sarcastically, but also truthfully said earlier, chicken soup for the soul, right? If this is for those who are old enough to know the series, you and I are old enough to an age where it may have been popular that. But yeah, there was a series of books, well-meaning, give people a little bit of inspiration, hope, something to cling to, a sense of resilience. And I definitely believe in that. I do believe you need hope and you need to have those kinds of inspiring stories. That's what I'm saying. There are enough of those out there that I think we could draw upon. So that's where I stand on that.
But let me, this is all kind of going back to this idea. Well, I think you kind of answered it. I mean, the idea that I always kind of like to ask people is what actually qualifies as Masonic research? Like what,
Everything,
where,
everything,
really? You're going to say,
everything.
really? So there's,
I gave the example earlier.
now,
Brett
see,
Morris
now I
and
want to
Andy
challenge
James are
this somehow.
interested.
I'm trying to think of what
No,
it,
they're interested in music, so all of a sudden they talk about here's Masonic musicians, just famous people or whatever, or Masonic songs. Maybe they go like, I'm going to track every known Masonic song published in the present German state, taking the six German kingdoms, Bavaria, Prussia, all that, whatever. But you're going to take like a geographical or time space period and say, this is my boundary. I'm going to do all of that kind of thing. Or someone else says, John Philip, like they're big into his music, and he was a Mason, and so they're gonna like draw out any of that kind of thing. These are all areas that don't interest me, but for the people who do, they can find a way to make it work. If you're interested in it, you can find a way to draw a correlation. If you're interested in global politics, there'll be a way to find it out, right? If you're interested in just famous people, you can find something with that. If you're interested in printmaking, you can do something with that lines. If you've got a thing about interesting language kind of things, how does a ritual get translated into another language? What are the choices of like when something ends up in French for the first time? Why does it end up that particular way in French, right? So
so you're saying everything qualifies as
everything,
Masonic
Chad.
research, and I'm okay with that. But the question is, Masonic research historically, there's been an elitism about it, right? There have been gates that are up or barriers to entry, and so you're kind of saying that there shouldn't be a barrier at entry. Whatever you're interested in, just go do something. Is
Right.
that what you're kind of
Yeah.
saying?
Correct. Yes, and then write about it. Now, let me state that it helps if you have an academic background, right? It certainly does. And if you are going to write, you should certainly be following certain minimum guidelines that people expect. Like, don't just start randomly throwing stuff out there without giving sources. It's not really easy for people to back that stuff up and then recreate what you did. But everyone learns this when they're like in a third grade science class or something to that effect. They talk about, all right, someone else needs to be able to repeat that thing. And if they can't repeat it, maybe it's difficult to say you've got the right thing. But I will always say it definitely helps if you have an academic background, but you don't have to write for academics. And even academics will write for quote unquote the common man, the man on the street. And then sometimes people who are not academics write for academics. They may not have the formal training, but they understand the ins and outs of what's expected, and they'll do that kind of thing too. But any topic for the most part, you can find a way. There are guys who are like, I'm interested in video games and masonry, and maybe somebody says, here's all the video game designers that are Masons, and here's the elements that they've introduced into these games, etc. Again, this is a video game. It's not like, this is a Masonic degree. Maybe it wasn't authorized, and yada yada, the standard kind of things. But if there's something out there, the chances are pretty good. Masonry is a big enough tent for most of us and for most things, unless it isn't actually masonry. And that's the caveat I like to throw out that people tend to forget. And this goes back to what you were talking about, a personal bias, something that's interesting to a person. And you can certainly write about it, but if it isn't actually masonry, don't conflate the two. And you've got a huge thing you're interested into it, there could be a potential tie over. But if there is not, don't BS us and create that connection when it isn't there. Just understand, don't introduce things as Masonic that are not Masonic.
I have to say,
just because the dude's a Mason doesn't mean it's Masonic.
As I get older, I'm getting a little less crabby and a little less of a jerk myself. Years ago, I wrote something mostly to be a jerk. I'll be honest. My background is I did the martial arts, and one of them is American Kenpo. There's a guy named Ed Parker who wrote a series of books that really were transformative to me. One of them is he talks about the symbolism between the tiger and the dragon in martial arts. So the tiger is heavenly wisdom, or pardon me, the dragon is heavenly wisdom, the tiger is earthly power. And so there's that dichotomy between power and wisdom, and how each has to temper each other. They have to be in balance, right? Too much thinking without the will means nothing gets done. Too much power without the wisdom means that shit gets broken, right? So I decided to be a jerk and said, well, actually, if you look at the two pillars at the entrance of King Solomon's temple, right? One of them has the earth on top. One of them has the heaven on top. If you look at really what the two names are, it really isn't, strength and to establish. It really is. I wove this whole narrative about how really it's the same argument of, heavenly wisdom versus earthly power. And of course, you walk right between the middle of them during the degree, which is to symbolize that balance. And I said, and my basic linking thing was that, well, Ed Parker was a Mormon, and, all their stuff comes from Masonry. So therefore, American Kenpo is Masonic. Got to be honest, though, I actually learned a lot by writing that. And once I actually sort of said, listen, no, I mean, there's only so many ways you can look at something, and this is just two ways of describing the same argument. No, it's not Masonic, but it is interesting. That's when I think it became useful, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Agreed. And this is what I was saying earlier, in connection with that, the way that could be helpful to some people is just make sure it's very clear. It's an opinion piece. It's just speculation. It is not like a historical anything. And you don't have to be an academic. You can just say, I find great interest in this. There's value to me. Maybe there's value to you, or something like that. And I've had to change on that as well. I started off really, man, I every bit as rotten. I would deliberately, throw some chum in the water, and see who would bite, and then go like, well, here's what it actually is. And then, but I've come around to that there can be room for that. But like I said, there always needs to be the qualification. You should make it clear that it's an opinion, and not everything is Masonic, just plain and simple. Not everything is, but you can research pretty much anything and draw it to Masonry in some way. Again, like, hey, I'm just interested in cataloging facts. Like, here's the number of baseball players from the 1989 year, Major League Baseball, who were Masons. Okay, cool. And maybe you find something interesting in that. Maybe you don't. Maybe it's just a collection of facts. But at least just make it clear that's what it is, not like, oh, and now all of a sudden Freemasonry and baseball are the same thing and whatever,
I think what's also interesting is I think people need to realize that when you start pulling at a thread, the next thing you know, like the threads you come up with are really, I think to be open to the fact that you're going to go down a rabbit hole, like, and almost look forward to it. I remember researching vaudeville because I like American theater, and finding out about Burt Williams, and finding out about I just lost his name. Sang Old Man River in Showboat. But both these two guys were African Americans, and Burt Williams was he was a Mason in a lodge in France, and when he died, the Grand Lodge of New York, who at that point didn't recognize Prince Hall Masonry, like gave him a Masonic funeral in the Actors Lodge in New York, and everybody and their brother showed up out of respect, and like, well, that's okay. That's a little interesting,
Yeah.
This guy, why can't I think of his name right now? It's driving me nuts. I don't know.
Is it Robeson?
Yes, Paul Robeson, so many great pains have been taken to erase this man from history that I feel like
Yes.
every Mason needs to just, I don't care what your politics are, because more than likely he's going to piss you off with his politics, regardless of where you are. At some point, he's held a position that you're not going to like.
Sure.
Don't care. Like, just his life, everybody should know about Paul Robeson, but yeah, Mason. Anyway, so sorry.
No, perfect. And so I'm going to return to what you're talking about here and say, I gave a discussion about this at the Midwest Conference of Education entitled Research for Anyone. And I use the word anyone because I think anyone could do it. And like I said, I do think it helps if you have an academic background and to make clear those things, but keep certain caveats in mind. And yes, one thing that I recommend for a lot of people who they may be interested is understand a lot of stuff has already been written, and how do you find that? And I go back to, if you're going to start with anything allegedly biblical, so anything that's referenced in a degree or anything in traditional Masonic history, iconography, you name it, um, don't just start like rehashing the wheel, is my advice, because there's probably an actual biblical scholar who's already written everything you can imagine, and about 29 different commentaries that have, picked it apart and whatever else, critiqued it and grown that since then. And what are you or I likely to provide for trying to rehash all of that? But that can be useful to use as your starting point, as a resource. Just, if you're there to discuss whatever those things are, just know that sometimes there's actual areas of research that you may not be familiar with in any number of things. There's a whole group of people who you may have stumbled into who are experts on lithography. Now, you and I don't run in their circles normally, but now you do, right?
I actually